Hi, this is Donovan. I'm finishing up that chapter on mental illness, chronic illness, pain, and how, the chapter is part two of, chapter four of part two in Sex and Sacrament. So this is right before the last chapter, and there's been two other episodes before this. So they've presented four sections. Um, and this is where we wrap it up. So this particular section, this second to last section, where we're going to pick this up, is called "We Need Each Other: Expressing God's Love in Community." So we've already been talking about, or I've already been sharing about individuals from history who have been spiritual leaders who may have had chronic mental illnesses and were not cured of it. I've been talking about the false expectation that sometimes is placed on people who live with chronic illnesses, disabilities, and mental health issues to be cured, as if that's the only way God's grace works. And so I shared a bit about some people that their disabilities, their experiences of mental illness, their experience of not being cured is part of what they've contributed. It didn't take away from their spiritual leadership. It was part of their journey, and they contributed a lot to spiritual communities in ways that have endured. Um, so I've been talking about how yeah, grace is not necessarily a curing those things that we think are wrong with us necessarily, or that we are afraid of in other people, but inclusive of our wounds and of our differences. All right. So anyway, I'll jump right in now. That kind of catches you up a little bit on the last two episodes. We need each other, expressing God's love and community. Personhood is not defined by the soul or mind alone, and salvation is not confined to mental or spiritual activity alone. So, in those spiritual communities, religious communities, faith communities that teach that their altar calls in their Jesus prayer or their affirmation of faith alone are all a person needs, um, those those are ignoring the sacredness of the whole person. If we teach that there's some special words, or that if we just say those magic words, everything's going to be fixed in a person's life and relationship with God. So those teachings, which are pretty common in certain communities, ignore the sacredness of the whole person, body and all, in a way that excludes people, often with disabilities, including neurological disabilities, from personhood and salvation, and mistakes mental illness for a lack of faith. So yeah, I talked about that in the earlier episodes, that it's one of the reasons I'm going on and on in this chapter is because a lot of people have told me, as I've done peer support work, as I've done suicide prevention work, as at the times that I was in ministry and things like that, that all too often, I want to say more often than not, people of faith have experienced being shamed in their communities that they of spiritual practice that they looked to for support. So that's why, a lot of times, regardless of religious tradition, people who struggle with serious mental illness or chronic illnesses are told, you must not have enough faith or else you'd be cured. So again, that's what I'm building on what we've talked about previously here. Even within their own tradition, Christian spiritual experience often happens in conservative Christian communities, unfortunately. Um, so even within the Christian tradition, though, spiritual experience centers in God as embodied and fleshed in Jesus, fully God, but also fully human. And here, for a little moment, I'm going to cite a bunch of scriptures because the few people that comment here are very concerned to know where the scriptural roots of these reflections are. All right, so this comes from 1 John 4. The creation stories of Jewish and Christian sacred texts affirm the human body as God created and good, with human personhood in some way reflecting God's own image and likeness. Again, this comes from the book of Genesis, the first chapter. Worship of God in both these traditions, Judaism and Christianity, involves the whole human self. And I could have added Islam to that as well. So the Abrahamic traditions, we use our whole body, our whole self, in loving God with our whole heart, mind, and strength, right? And that comes from Deuteronomy 6. That's in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, Matthew 22. It's something that Jesus apparently said a lot. To love God with our whole selves means loving other human beings as whole selves as well. Body, brain, not just mind, not just some ethereal spirit, but the whole self. Not only Jesus, but Jewish law itself commanded this, that we love the whole person and that we love with our whole selves. And again, this comes from Leviticus 19, verse 18. I know Leviticus is a problem chapter for some folks. Matthew 22, verse 39, Mark 12, 31, and Luke 10, 27. So my point here is it's a thread that runs through Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, that we don't just love people for their mind, or if their mind is intact, or if their mind thinks a certain way. The teachings of the Abrahamic traditions teach us to love the whole person with our whole self for the sake of God, for whom we love with our whole selves, and who created and loves us with God's whole self. So why do we so often now find this dangerous emphasis on making a mental decision for faith? Hearing it as if hearing and understanding certain words, sacred texts and prayers, is necessary for a person's faith to be genuine and for God to work through them. One clear and early example, and again, this is just one small example, comes from the foundational teacher of Christian doctrine, the 4th century Bishop Augustine of Hippo. Now, I've talked a lot about some sort of underappreciated aspects of his work in almost all of the earlier chapters. But here's a place that those who are critical of Augustine's work know all too well. There are many examples of this type of thinking in his work, but one of the clearest and simplest is in his autobiography, where he simply says, "I am my mind." And Augustine, this is just one place where he says it as clear as day, but Augustine he's kind of known for explicitly refusing to identify his selfhood with his physicality. And I've mentioned in earlier chapters, he struggled with sexual desire, that overwhelmed him, that he felt like it was a compulsion, that he wasn't able to direct it or live in moderation with it. So his response seems to have been a very extreme one. For him, he almost needed to not identify with his body. That was his way of managing that and dealing with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's something we all have to do. But anyway, so Augustine, being the father of the Christian church and the father of systematic theology, and not systematic theology, but in some ways he has had a disproportionately wide and long-lasting influence on what developed as Christian teaching. So his tendency to say, "I am my mind," and not identify with his body, set the stage for a dualism that really took hold in Western religious and spiritual and philosophical traditions, that pits the mind and reason against the needs, wisdom, and creativity of bodies and the senses. Now, in more recent times, some heart-centered spiritualities, and I'm thinking here of like pietism and revivalistic movements and folk spiritualities, do focus on the importance of an intimate, warm, personal, and constant relationship with God. But in the West, at least, and then I'll speak to what I know a little bit better, right? The U.S. We still, even in those heart-centered, relationship-centered traditions, we tend to present human influence in this relationship with God as overbearing. For example, the believer's heart growing cold and distant is believed in most of these traditions to cause God to withdraw. In other words, if you're lukewarm, if you're not feeling these warm fuzzy feelings with God, there tends to be this doubt that your own faith, or that someone else that you're judging to be lukewarm, that their faith is real. And that there tends to come in this sense of melancholy, despair, in one's own life. If I'm not feeling those warm fuzzies and that emotional high in my relationship with God, then I must be doing something wrong. And that spreads to a sort of like judging of people who are not on that emotional high as well. So I'm quoting here. I'm really summarizing something that's been explained very well by people that like Julius Rubin, who study religious melancholy, and Ann Taves, her book Fits and Trances, but who studied that sort of development of the really mind-centered, word and study-centered type of spirituality in the United States, and that other sort of heartwarming, effusive, relational kind of stream of spirituality, and how they can sometimes be critical of each other, and they also have extremes that can be unhelpful for the people in them, right? So that's kind of what I'm trying to draw on here. So do these traditions really mean that human beings are more powerful than God's grace and love by emphasizing how we're feeling in the relationship, or what we're saying, or how we're praying? Do we really have the power to drive God out, to push God away from us, just because we have some ups and downs in our emotional life, or some ins and outs of our ways of thinking? We're only limited human beings after all, and God knows that, right? So I'm just asking the questions. Are human beings more powerful than God's grace and love? Do we have the power to drive away the one who is in all, is in all things and everywhere, just by some variability of our emotions? I don't think even in these traditions they would want to say that. So in contrast with contemporary bullying and exclusion of the vulnerable from these faith communities, the sacred texts of these traditions clearly teach that all of us are made in God's image, and that the love and grace of God works not only through a person to produce fruit for other people, but also works in each person for healing, wholeness, and transformation. God deals with individuals as, okay, now I'm going to go into really Christian here, evangelical stuff for a minute, but I'm going to try to explain it. God deals with individuals as made right, as complete, as healed and holy. And that's what the words justified and sanctified mean. Okay, so justified is God. It's a Christianese jargon kind of word that in English, the English translation of what's in the Greek in the Bible, it just means God sees us as made right. God sets our accounts right, or God treats us as if, the debts we owe, or the wrongs we've done are not the only way God defines us. God sees us as set right. And then the sanctified thing, that means, I've talked about it in earlier chapters, especially in part 1. We're talking about an ancient understanding of sin, in which sin just means I'm falling away. I'm disintegrating. I'm being less than I was created to be. And so the opposite of that, the being saved, being made whole, comes from root words for healing and wholeness. So sanctified really means I'm being made complete. I'm being restored and growing into all that God meant me to be, all that I was created to be. So it's that fullness of life. So I don't really like to use the words justified and sanctified because that excludes so many people that it's just jargon that doesn't, it really seems to push a lot of folks away. Whereas the idea that those words express that God doesn't define us by the things we owe or the wrongs we've done alone, that God sets our balance back to neutral, right? Or sees, sets things right with us, and that God restores us to completeness and in fact grows us beyond what we even maybe thought we could be. Those ideas that those words justification and sanctification express are pretty universal ideas. They're things that no matter who you are as a human being, maybe those are relatable concepts, that I can grow and that I'm more than my worst act. So anyway, I'm going to go back to what I was saying. God deals with individuals in those ways, in those making right, in those healing, completing, fulfilling kinds of ways, regardless of our mental function. God is not manipulated into loving us, doesn't have to be manipulated into loving us by the power of our human intellectual or verbal efforts. We don't sway God into, oh, just now I said the right word, so God, you have to love me, right? That's not really, it comes across that way in the way communities practice and teach these things, but if they really dig down, I don't think that's what they mean to say. That's certainly not what the original meaning of these traditions ever was. We don't manipulate God into loving us. We don't push the right buttons and now God works for us. Rather, it's simply out of God's own natural and boundless grace and love, which are beyond our limited capacity to recognize or understand whoever we are. All of us humans don't have full mental capacity to understand God's boundless love. We're on the same boat there. God doesn't need our individual action, even a cognitive decision, a decision for faith. God doesn't need some kind of individual perfection of our human character. I did it right. I'm the right kind of person for God to love now. Even a sane and always stable, steady consciousness, God does not need that in order to love and help us. When God works in us to make us complete, to help us love perfectly. And again, those are things that in certain Christian traditions are described by the English words justification and sanctification, but with or without those particular words expressing it, God works in us to make us complete. God works to help us love perfectly. Even in the evangelical stream of Christian tradition, God's work in us is synergistic, which means God is working with us. God's not depending on us to do the work so that God can be effective, but God does work with us. It's a synergistic kind of. The other thing I wanted to say about that, God's work is transformative. God changes us and regenerates us. Again, I'm talking about the Christian tradition. So if this is not what everybody believes, that's okay. I am talking about a tradition where a lot of people have been excluded, and I'm trying to invite people who are in this tradition to think a little bit more deeply about what the words and more importantly, the meaning under particular translations and habits of thought about those words, what this really means. So if we really look at whether it's the sacred texts or the actual ancient practices or even the early days of evangelical and revival movements, God works with us to transform us, to regenerate or regrow us, rebirth us, and to change our individual behavior, character, and consciousness, making us new. That's what regenerate means, as a natural process, not something that we initiated or did, but a natural process that flows out of our loving, intimate relationship with God. So that's how it's synergistic. If I'm experiencing the love of God, whether or not I'm fully conscious of it, whether or not I can verbalize it, if that love is in me and I'm in it and it's flowing through me, change is going to happen. I don't have to have the perfect brain in order for that process to work. God graciously gives to us what we don't possess and can't achieve on our own. In these traditions, I'm speaking mostly about Christian tradition here in an evangelical bent that tends to be one of the more intensely focused on, you have to say the right words and you have to understand this the right way, and if you're lukewarm, something's terribly wrong. So in these traditions, God can and does lovingly reach out to us in spite of ourselves. In the same way, we need not only the help of God, but also the help of our communities of faith. We need God and people to reach out to us, just like God does. God reaches out to us. That's what, even in the most conservative interpretations, the focus is on grace. What is done for us that we can't do for ourselves, what's done for us that we can't earn. So this divine spirit is doing that, and those who are living together as a community, expressing this divine spirit together, we're supposed to be doing that too as a community. So many of those who follow evangelical teachings today, especially the Reformed or Calvinist interpretations, seem to have lost track of the importance of grace that once were their foundation. And here I'm going to go all the way back to 16th century Swiss theologian John Calvin, one of the very first founders of this tradition, who taught that the community is called to respond to the image of God in each person, regardless of that person's present condition. And this is a direct quote from his systematic theology, his life work, the Institutes. He says, "Scripture helps in the best way when it teaches that we are not to consider what people merit or earn of themselves, deserve. We're not to consider what people merit of themselves, but to look upon the image of God in everyone, the image of God to which we owe all honor and love. Therefore, whatever person you meet who needs your aid, you have no reason to refuse help to them. Say, he's a stranger. Say, he's contemptible and worthless. Say that you owe nothing for any service of his. Say that they do not even deserve your least effort for their sake. But the image of God, which recommends them to you, is worthy of your giving yourself and all your possessions." End quote. And I said this in the last episode, I think. So I'm talking now about how we as communities of faith treat people who are stigmatized for having certain experiences of brain and body disability, mental health concerns and challenges, cognitive differences. But can you hear how this is also relevant? If we can't even be hospitable as we have been called to do by scriptures and the founders of the traditions that we follow, how can we be hospitable to people who are different in other ways, right? So I hope anyway, at the very least, this seems like it should be obvious that we should be expressing compassion to all people, regardless of whether or not they're having other kinds of challenges with their body, mind, brain, emotions, moods. Building on this discussion of kind of the communities that kind of take this to an exclusive extreme and have not been the most hospitable of late. I want to talk about too Karl Barth, who's another, again, in that Reformed tradition that I just was talking about, Calvin, who was one of the founders of it. So Karl Barth is really known in the 20th century for his active opposition to Nazism and fascism. He was anti-fascist, right? Very actively so, to the point that, very relatably, he got fired from his university teaching post for refusing to take an oath to something he couldn't believe in this case, Adolf Hitler, and he was exiled from Germany. He lost his university teaching post because he believed in grace, because he did, but anyway, so he, as a Reformed theologian, anyway, never mind. He built on this idea: hearing, proclaiming, confessing, and living the word of God, embodied in Jesus Christ. And it's this idea of the word that seems to get people in this tradition sometimes really focused on verbal communication and intellectual capacity to consent. Bart said, hearing, proclaiming, confessing, and living the word is not primarily a private, individual experience, but it needs to happen publicly and in community. The community must confess its shared faith. It's not about the individual. The community must confess its shared faith. And the community's confession, by God's grace, includes its members who are unable to confess for themselves. For example, due to an injury or illness of the brain. And for those of us who have loved ones with dementia, Alzheimer, brain injury, we're talking about how the community stands with that person in the faith experience, in their faith journey. Even if they cannot understand or articulate that relationship verbally, people's relationship with an experience of God contributes meaningfully not only to their own lives, but also to the shared life of the community. They don't have to say the words of a certain prayer or understand consistently or at all certain mental concepts in order to experience grace. And when we live grace that way together, it makes us a better community. It enriches the experience of grace of everybody that's in that community. Genuine experience of God through and in our whole selves brings each of us individually and all of us communally back to the good news. That's the meaning of the word gospel. The good news that Jesus taught and spread, that death and suffering are not the final word in human existence, that new life is possible, bearing the fruits of God's Spirit in loving service within ourselves, with and to each other. And the last section of this chapter is called Touching the Wounds. Touching the Wounds, community, chronic illness, and God's boundless loving grace. This is the conclusion. Everything praises God. Darkness, privations, defects, evil too. Praise God and bless God, wrote the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart. And I've mentioned him before as someone that's, roughly a contemporary of Catherine of Siena. Went through some really dangerous, frightening times as well in world history, and was tried. He was tried as a heretic and found not guilty, but he went through some stuff with the church too. I almost use a different word than stuff. So for those of us that have been dragged by the church, Meister Eckhart is one of us. He's been through that. Even suffering can be so he was saying, if you heard that quote, everything praises God, darkness, privations, defects, evil too, praise God and bless God. So even suffering can be a creatively transforming means of grace. Privations, this is what he's talking about. In the Bible, now I want to transition to talking about what's in the sacred text there. In the Bible, for example, Jacob wrestles with God, resulting in a hip injury that causes him lifelong pain and limping. For the rest of his life, he limps and has chronic pain. And that reshapes his very identity. And it's that woundedness that he lives with for the rest of his life that causes God, and the intimacy, that causes God to give him a new name, Israel. So this is in Genesis 32. This is foundational for all three of the Abrahamic traditions. Likewise, the Apostle Paul's experience in the Christian tradition of a thorn in his flesh that persists in spite of his frequent prayerful petitions to God to remove it, encourages, it's not taken away, he has to live with it. This encourages a humility that he seems desperately to need, in contrast with these ecstatic heavenly heights of his mystical prayer life. Paul sometimes had these experiences. Oh, I was taken up into the seventh heaven and I saw all these glorious things. He often had these sort of out of body mystical experiences of union that are several places in the Bible where it talks about that. He talks about it, and Acts talks about it. So he had these wonderful sort of religious ecstasies, but he also had this ongoing thorn in the flesh that wouldn't go away. And Catherine of Siena is one that pointed out, that this seemed to balance him out. To have that ongoing suffering was a good thing for him, kind of brought him back down to earth. Even Christians' belief in the resurrection of Jesus recognizes that our own individual and specific woundedness may continue, even when healing and new life take place. Our suffering and scars are part of what connects us with each other as beloved community. Jesus was resurrected with his wounds, and it is by these wounds that his followers recognize him. And that is a really important passage that I would point you to in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 20, the story of doubting Thomas. Jesus even tells his doubt-filled friend and follower Thomas not only to look at, but to touch his wounds. He tells Thomas to put his hand into the deep wound in his side. This moment is sacramental. Like I was talking about sacrament, this whole, it's the title of the book, Sex and Sacrament, and I talk about it a lot at the beginning of part 2. What is sacrament? It's making visible to our limited human senses the reality of a sacred truth that's beyond our human senses. So touching the wound is a sacrament. It's the touch and the sight and the listening to the words, the voice of Jesus telling him this, and those things, that his senses are what bring Thomas to that deeper faith that, wait a minute, death isn't the end. There's something going on here. This moment leads to Thomas's faith in Jesus' resurrection, and to Thomas' faith in the unwavering power and love of God. Jesus' example teaches us the importance of sharing the reality of our enduring wounds with each other as part of who we are individually and together. And that's really different than what we seem to pick up, whether explicitly or just in a way that's implied in the way that we live together as faith communities, where those wounds are embarrassing. I shouldn't talk. Nice people don't talk about those things, or what will people think, or because, like I've been saying, I know I've been saying it a lot this whole chapter, because there are so many people who directly or indirectly seem to believe or express that, well, if you're suffering, if you have a wound, then you must have done something wrong. God must be punishing you. And if it's not cured, and if I can still see that wound, then you must not have enough faith. Well, if that's true, you'd have to say that to Jesus, because Jesus came back with his wounds, and it was only by his wounds that his friends knew him. Right? So there's a huge lesson for us in that. We have to show each other our wounds. So if I struggle with trauma, if I struggle with pain, if I struggle with doubt, if I struggle with even something embarrassing like, I have chronic depression, or think about suicide. So now I'm saying some things that are real. If you know me, and I've been very public in my writings about these things, in my sermons, but I've had some dark nights of the soul. That's something that happens with me sometimes. Less so since I came out, but still, it's the point is, when we share that, we get to also share how God is resurrecting us and helping us live through that. I have wounds, but I'm not just my wounds. That's why I came out personally myself. That's why I came out in the first place. I was trying to express, look what God has done. I'm a person who was suffering so much. I was gonna die. Everybody thought I was gonna die, and I lived. And yeah, I got some wounds, but look what God did. Look what God can do, right? God can use and work in this wounded body, mind, life. So we need to share that. This is what Jesus modeled. We need to share that. This resurrection also conveys that even when suffering scars us, when it continues to endure in some form, it's not our whole story. Human existence has worth and purpose. We need not resign ourselves to tragic meaningless. Life itself is not only a wound. It's the beauty of this gospel, this good news, is that it's both. We're not denying the reality of the wounds, nor are we saying that the wounds are all there is to us. It's both. It's both. And that's John 21, right? That's really the resurrection story, the bothness of it. In this tradition, even God is recognized and loved not only for divine victory over suffering, the resurrection, but also by God's sharing the human experience of suffering with us. God is not only an impersonal, inhuman, abstract ideal for only our minds to think about and comprehend, but is rather the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands, in the words of Whitehead. Though it is a very real part of what shapes our identities and recognition of one another in community, suffering is not the final word about God, nor about human existence. That's another thing this story tells us. Resurrection, new life, witness, so seeing each other's wounds, and community, staying together, even in spite of our woundedness, or connected by our woundedness. It's both. All gracious gifts of God's wild and boundless love, and they're all possible. Faith in God is expressed simply for Christians by following Jesus daily in life, and for any of us through our daily bearing witness, our ceremonies, devotion, and worship, our acts of service and compassion, and in the living devotion of our moment by moment relationships with God and with our community of faith or our community of practice, whatever that looks like for us. Sharing and recognizing in our communities of shared practice, both the new life and the scars we still bear, connects us to one another, to ourselves, and to God, just as Thomas was connected to Jesus and came to faith. Tangible expressions of compassion and care replace fear, criticism, and judgment when we share these wounds and bear witness to them. And that addresses the realities of chronic pain and mental illness in a way that enhances well-being, not only for the individual struggling with such illness or wounds, but also for the community of faith as a whole. Our relationship with God and with each other may include, but is not limited to, only enduring and addressing suffering and martyrdom. We're not only a martyr community. We're not only a suffering community. Our experiences of resurrection, new life, those we experience and those to which we bear witness, and the sacramental touching of each other's wounds, those resurrection wounds, wounds that aren't all that defines us, but wounds that show I've been through some stuff and I'm still here. These are encouraged by Jesus himself and are healing means of grace. Some of our wounds still endure after our individual life is renewed, surrendered to God, and lived in faithful community. When we reveal these wounds to each other, and when we touch, bear witness to, and anoint these wounds with each other, we open ourselves to healing from the threefold separation that pervades our daily lives, from ourselves, from each other, and from the source of all that is. So that's the end of this chapter. And the point was, the moral of the story was, there's no pain, there's no shame in having pain, past or present. There's no shame in being different of mind and body, past or present. And that bearing witness to that in ourselves by sharing those parts of ourselves, and then that's not all we are, bearing witness to each other's wounds, and that that's not all we are, is what it means to be part of, a big part of what it means to be beloved community, right? So, all right, I probably made that point too many times, but that really goes sideways a lot of time. And it concerns me because a lot of people get a lot of harm when we don't embrace that.